The criminal reduction of status by the use of surveillance human trafficking is actively engaged from secret mechanisms which engage in various nerve hacking technologies, which is commonly engaged with the use of military functions, which is apt because this is currently a civil war by a Confederate insurrection using military equipment and intelligence against the American public in order to craft the government against the civilian government, at which point it is disbarred from being a republic by these felons. The acknowledgement of the original engagements from their original sites, from courts that were obligated when myself and many others were much younger, should have happened long before that even, required American judges and not Confederate felons. The insurrection, derived by the kangaroo courts for false verdicts, engages in the act of sabotage and tampering with the use of evidence and planting of evidence and manipulation of the overarching scenario. The defamation engages for the purpose of permanent unrepairable damages so that they can create a false list of justifications to their criminal functions against the Americans as they systematically replace the Republic with the Confederate terrorist organization, actively engaged from the KKK functions, at which point the KKK forms several times throughout American history and engages in many times the either disillusionment by the use of superior force or by the fact that they accomplish their mission, at which point they disband after they accomplish their mission, having acquired their insurgencies in the American government or general policies, such as the systems of normalizing their racist functionality, at which point they have active policies such as the racist eugenics functions, which are often funded by the government through universities. And now, many of these functions includes the use of terrorist harassment in secret, and when they qualify the function of secret, they have a band of people who actively seek to control the situation, in which case they're the only ones who are allowed in the basic vicinity of the um, functional issue, at which point all of them can lie about it. Now, their infiltration into the police, sheriffs, FBI, military, etc., gives them the false legitimacy of the office they're not loyal to. As felons, they are functionally disqualified from being in them, and as felons who have successfully infiltrated it, they are able to cover for the overarching offense, qualifying their system of lies as a Confederate society. Now, the engagement of the Confederate society is a complete and total stable network of nations, which specifically, as a nation, have the capacity to these overarching strategies. They are a 100% espionage based terrorist organization. And as a single functioning nation of these repeating offenses that qualify the normalization of these strategies, at which point they criminalize evidence, especially in military and espionage, such as the FBI and sheriffs, etc., claiming the function that they are superior to the Constitution, which is the direct acknowledgement of their Confederate loyalties as felon terrorists. Now, these engagements have actively engaged in the systematic abuses against the American public for substantive changes against the American economy and politics and all other functions of normal society, at which point the general public, being traumatized, is actively poisoned and drugged and engaged in many programs in order to substantively change their biological outcomes, such as the suppression of them when they're growing up to change how they end up, or the acts of poisoning them, such as the reproduction and protection of poisons in general products, such as Monsanto milk, and many of the other issues, at which point, despite the fact that these issues were reported on and acknowledged as legally viable, they were protected offenses to continue for the reproduction of the offense, at which point you have their eugenics racist program, which is actively seeking the poisoning of the general public in order to engage in testosterone reduction, which is an active function usually leveraged through California and the transgender movements and all of the other excuses to the normalization and false legitimization of the felon actions of the general public being endangered by their systematic alterations, at which point the unwilling and unwitting public receiving the criminal injuries are put in an unreversible damage scenario, compelling the immediate correction. Now, the normalization of the original economy with the American politics compels the government loyal to the United States to engage in the full correction, the uncensoring, publishing, and enforcing of the duel with David and the other leaders of the United States against the Confederates, and the leaders of the Confederacy engaged in the trial between which government should take over, the Americans or the Confederates, qualifies the obligation to see whether or not we can, in fact, exist as a functioning society, or if we are collectively dedicated to the idea of permanently being lied to and defrauded and conned and robbed, at which point there is an express injury normalized with inside the Confederate fraud wizards. Their use of frame jobs with defamation and control of the evidence breaks all forms of investigation mechanisms, such as the chain of custody, and many other issues, such as the obstruction of justice of key information, which is essential, at which point you can recognize publicly whether or not this is true by the investigation in whether or not judges are actively blocking the ability of engaging in legal recourse to the innocent being falsely convicted by the use of proof, at which point they would systematically set up various schemes and mechanisms to block the recourse of the proof of their innocence through de facto court functions, at which point the protocols from the court superseding their law subjugation is a normalization of the use of wizard sorcery, at which point the action of the conclusion, the action breeds the conclusion that the innocent are punished as a function of slave raid mechanisms, which does seem to intend towards many of the black community and others, at which point you have the falsification of evidence and protected convictions of a traumatized group who are actively being framed, at which point you have a lawless system for the slave raiders, which is exactly the perfect environment necessary for the Confederacy to progress against the American rule of law, which the American judges are obligated to get off their dumbass butts and start prosecuting the function of the insurrection against the Americans, at which point the act of doing their fucking job and getting rid of these criminal policies, which is their obligation, is essential to their existence as Americans, at which point the dereliction of duty through the systematic terrorism and after-the-fact rulings qualifies the manipulation and evolution as a virus against the United States by the function of a parasite, blocking the immune system from correcting against it. They guarantee the death of the host. The functions of refusing to assist the Americans in the Civil War, such as the compulsion of the duel with David and the Confederates, is an active criminal vulnerability to yourself, your community, and your children. the CIA has actively been using the Confederate functions to manage the black market, as well as the military and many of the others. The function of the Confederate insurgency infiltrates programs and offices of every kind, including the sheriffs, all of which have actively maintained the active black market, including the pedophile market, such as the framing of people and the manufacturing of the distribution of human life, such as the distribution of sex trades, such as the distribution of child sex slaves and child abuse as a functional dominatrix sexual fetish, engages in the lust of the physical harm towards the minors, which is the normalization of their sexual satisfaction on the abuse itself. Now, beyond the sexual release of actually having normal sex, the porn aspect of their physical reaction and positive association with the use of hurting someone becomes the subject, at which point it compounds exponentially when you have people of value and particular tastes and superior functions. The more valuable the target, the more vulnerable, the more exclusive, the more niche the issue, the more the satisfaction would generically be provided, such as those who have the specific Joffrey sexual interest of the use of tormenting their victims, at which point Joffrey from Game of Thrones would engage in the abuse and murder of prostitutes as the sexual satisfaction, which is an actual normal function and social thing protected within inside these organizations loyal to the Confederacy, at which point it compounds exponentially and spreads throughout it. Many of the sheriffs and judges that I know loyal to the Confederacy have been actively been viewed as the function of creeps that require the general community to kind of secretly talk amongst themselves in order to subvert the superior power generated by the office held by the felons loyal to the Confederates, at which point it's an extremely dangerous function, at which point every parent that refuses to comply with this specific order is putting their child in danger by the rapists who will abuse them exponentially, as well as all of the others. Every single one of you is a pedophile. There are no exceptions. Your intentional refusal to abide by your obligations in the security of the things put under your control to secure is your specific aiding and abetting with the criminal action. You are a part of the crime. You are guilty of the crime. You are obligated to protect them. You are obligated to stop being a dumb fuck and get off your queefing fucking face and go do the right fucking thing. Engage in the proper investigations, uncensoring publics. Force them into the duel. Do not give the Confederates a single fucking inch on any of these issues. These are exponential, catastrophic, unreversible injuries, and you have to, by any sense of American law and justice and reason, compelled to do so. These systems described by the felon insurgents actively function as bad faith subversions of the fairness required for their function in government, at which point they are disqualified from their function in any meaningful legal mechanism, at which point ignoring that is the aiding and abetting insurrection system, which is actively reproducing the negative results against the Americans with the damages to the public function, at which point, again, bad faith disqualifies them from government. If they are not loyal to the United States Constitution, they are not Americans. If they are loyal to any function that subverts the rule of law in their false translations or subversions or cons or deceits of any kind, they are not Americans. Their active function that concludes an anti-legal functions is criminal interest. Their subversion of the definition of a law in one part as to collapse its meanings against the Constitution and other high law, then you have the act of insurrection normalized by the Confederate traitors, which has been attempted by many in the intelligence apparatus, in the military, in the Supreme Court, and many others. They are not loyal to the United States. Their act of insurrection for the Confederacy disbars them from any legal courts, qualifying their obligation to the engagement of the duel without their presence within inside the authority of the court positions. They don't have a right to have access to any of the major functions of the court. They can't be judges, they can't be bailiffs, they can't be anything besides the Confederate representatives. Again, it is essential to understand that the criminal support of these functions aids and abets the use of the subversion of justice by the support of the Confederate judges, which have infiltrated the Supreme Court and others, actively seek the criminal position of the subversion of the Constitution, such as the disbarring of the possibility of remedy against Confederate attacks, mislabeled secrets, which is the function of aiding and abetting an intentionally criminal action by the government against civilians to engage in the activity and the function of war against civilians, the war crime against Americans, as the highest threat to national security on the planet throughout history. Now, this system of protecting against Confederate injuries from legal remedy by the blocking and obstruction of justice allows for the false convictions and the prevention of the American recovery against the Confederate overthrow of the government. They are not Americans, and this is an exponential, permanent threat to every man, woman, and child on the planet, because once the Americans are no longer capable of restraining the Confederate insurrectionists, their empire will exponentially expand towards all their bigoted targets, at which point the functional concept of the Middle East having engaged in criminal wars through the war on terror would just be the icing on the cake compared to the absolute horror and tragedy generated by these fucking psychopaths. It is essential to understand that the Confederate function is absolutely, undeniably insurrection, treason, sedition, high crimes. They are not Americans. The functional policies of the Confederacy, such as the ones actively pushed by Lindsey Graham to replace the American system by terrorism and ex post facto, engages in the normalization and functional insurrectional positions of human trafficking of the American public in order to block the political system from being able to mature at its original rate, qualifying the overthrow of the United States government. Their targeting for any reason whatsoever and the removal of rights for any reason whatsoever is specifically prohibited by the Constitution and is an act of war by the Confederate terrorists. They are not American. They are an active threat to national security. Again, this is very important. The nerve hacking insurrectionist surveillance functions designed to infiltrate the home without the use of crossing normal barriers, such as is actively promoted by the FBI, James Comey, and many others. The nerve hacking was supported by, I believe it was Rand Paul when he was Speaker of the House. He actively pushed it through. It is a criminal insurrectionist surveillance program. It is designed as the cover policy for the Manchurian Candidate, exponentially increasing false flags around the United States and around the world, qualifying their systems of being able to actively control whatever person they want to in order to craft the malicious narratives enforced by the use of the surveillance against their targets, at which point all members involved become exponentially vulnerable and are defamed by the use of being attacked through the surveillance, nerve hacking, and other functions through their criminal crafting of the narrative, which is human trafficking. The functional order of the play to orchestrate the manufacture of the specific fruit of the poison tree narrative by the nerve hacking functions is criminal exponential war crimes against the American public, which must be destroyed for anyone to be safe. The systematic taking of territory and land for the functional living space function of their expansion, of their use of armed robbery and subversion of justice, allows them to functionally replace members of the government, replace members of the Congress, replace members of the general public and economy, allowing for the systematic destruction of the general social engagements, allowing for their general expansion. Now, their expansion of their Nazi living space functions, such as the Nazi roommate play, which would probably be in my source material, qualifies the normalization which they've actively done in the Manifest Destiny, which was actively normalized with the war with the Indians when taking the entire United States for the consumption of all of the territory and the replacements, at which point the Confederate insurrection is doing that same thing, but against the Americans, targeting the premier American leaders from their military projections, using American equipment against Americans for the strategy of the destruction of the American cultures, which is the active melting pot of all of the variations of the sub-societies which would normally exist, such as the society that they projected for David Bowles' character long before the 80s would have been engaged. They had been planning for this, at which point the system of the targeting and substantive changes of the relationships, associations, economic arrangements, statuses, and things that are legally supposed to be protected in their obligation to secure are actively ignored in order to socially engineer, which is a series of hate crimes. Their KKK overthrow of the United States normalizes their objective policies. So they are all exclusively felon hate criminals. Every single one of them, there are no exceptions. They're all aiding and abetting to the functional hate crimes. All forms of bigoted violence, such as social engineering, is a hate crime. They are terrorists. From the use of terrorist threats, which are credible, backed up by violence, in secret and in public, for the intimidation of the general public into compliance with the death cycle of the general public as slaves to serfs of the Confederate insurrectionists seeking the normalization of their feudalist system in order to manufacture and normalize the magic system from their Confederate KKK wizards as the leaders over the United States, with a false democracy of the terrorist wizards being the only ones being able to negotiate what does or does not occur inside the general society through the use of violence for the social engineering or the violation of liberty of self-determination concerning morality, religion, etc., in traumatized compliance through dark psychology, which is the function of the least amount of good in order to acquire the most evil, in order to keep the general public traumatized and vulnerable and censored, so that there is absolute corrupt power over them, at which point you have the death cycle of the society through the functional normalization of the corruption in question. Again, it is important to understand that they control the functional news engagements, at which point the Confederate owned, CIA owned news organization through Project Mockingbird and other developments actively engages in the censoring of narratives and opposition as to specifically subvert the fairness doctrine, which is supposed to be a part of the time of the case with myself and many others, at which point their use of the criminal assaults and censorship and human trafficking are designed for terrorism for after the fact rulings, which is specifically prohibited and fundamental to the replacing of the United States with its most hated enemies. Any fair observation of that would consider that criminal censorship. Now, the function of their use of violence instead of other some subversive algorithm is still most viably censorship, at which point it is the more brutal, more malicious, subversive censorship, at which point you'll have many that are compromised in their favor who will actively downplay and subvert it and misdirect the concept as to make the most important information not taken seriously so that all of the trauma is recognized in the general public cannot receive a proper remedy, which is their purpose as Confederates to prevent the possibility of American remedies to Confederate injuries. In 1983, they tried to normalize and legalize through the subversion of law and the Constitution by the courts to protect military abuses against the public, at which point civilians being tortured was an act of normalization which the courts wanted to protect in order to subvert the United States by the use of war against civilians, at which point the blocking of the remedy is an act of treason, insurrection, and high crimes, which is the normal function of the terrorists. Now, this policy, specifically prohibited by the Constitution, was not validated by the United States by their specific violation of the rule of law. They are in breach through bad faith, thus disqualifying themselves as felon conspirators in treason, sedition, and high crimes, disqualifying any potential verdict by these Confederate traitors.